Hi, thank you so much for joining me today. This is Gary Zacharias. You're listening to the Apologist Bookshelf. I want to do a book that's new for me, although it's about a 3-year-old book by Titus Kennedy, Kennedy. It's called Excavating the Evidence for Jesus, subtitled The Archaeology and History of Christ and the Gospels. Now, Kennedy, if that name rings a bell, I've done a couple of podcasts on an earlier book of his called Unearthing the Bible. And that one went from Old Testament to New Testament. Spent a lot of time in the Old Testament as far as archaeological research and what it's showing about the reliability of the gospel. It's a beautiful book. That first one is just gorgeous with some pictures that he's taken and some information from archaeology, and then he ties it into the Bible. So who's Kennedy? Well, they've got a picture of him on the back here. Looks like another Indiana Jones. But he's a professional field archaeologist, and he directs archaeological projects in Bible lands, and he researches, he writes. He's an adjunct professor at Biola. He's a research fellow at the Discovery Institute. Just been really involved in all sorts of things connected with the Bible. And now he's got this second book. And it says, on the back, it says, no other figure has impacted history like Jesus, yet today he's often seen as a mythical character. But what does the real evidence show from history and archaeology? That's what he wants to focus on. And so he has looked firsthand at what is out there regarding the birth of Jesus, the ministry of Jesus, his crucifixion, and his resurrection. He's gone to places where Jesus walked. He's looked at artifacts that have been connected to his life. So this book progresses chronologically through the Gospels, and he notes as he's going through, what have they been finding when it comes to archaeology and history and the geography of the region and even literary findings. And they say at the back here, you can decide for yourself whether the evidence confirms the existence and the story of Jesus and determine if the Gospels are worthy of being approached not as legends but as history. And I think you'll get a really good understanding of the historic basis of Christianity. And by the way, a person that I admire a lot, I think is a sharp individual, Dr. Stephen Meyer. He's the author of The Return of the God Hypothesis. He calls this book beautifully illustrated, extensively documented, and clearly written. And he says that Kennedy provides, quote, the most comprehensive archaeological defense yet in print of the historical reliability of the Gospels and their account of the life of Jesus of Nazareth. Yeah, so let's just take a look. I mean, there's so much to say about the book, but why don't we just plunge into it? Okay, so I'm going to do chapter 1, which is titled The Birth of Jesus, Bethlehem, and the Magi. And kind of appropriate because I'm doing this roughly at the time of Christmas anyway. So they've got a map to start out here showing the Roman Empire at the time of Jesus, which I think is helpful. And they're saying that Jesus comes into a world that is dominated by the Romans and Herod, right? And that's what Jesus comes into when the Romans annexed the area. That was 63 BC. They enlarged the republic of the Roman Empire. So in 40 BC, Herod the Great is dubbed King of the Judeans by the Senate. And so he took power with the conquest of Jerusalem in 37 BC, and his kingdom expanded, and of course it was a client state of Rome, so Rome got to pull the strings on it. Well, what about the Roman Empire itself? Well, in 27 BC, Octavian became first citizen. He was given that title by the Senate, and he became called Augustus, or venerated, and he then avenged the assassination of Julius Caesar by 42 BC. If we go back a little bit, you might remember the story from Shakespeare or whatever. You had a triumvirate at first with Marcus Lepidus and Mark Antony, and eventually Augustus comes to power, and the extent of his power had just never been matched in the Roman Republic. But instead of people being worried by him, he was so trusted and beloved that actually his effectiveness as a ruler was never surpassed, even by later Roman emperors. Now, they still called it the Roman Republic, but in practice, it was really an empire. Now, Augustus had complete power, and so he took over, and he consolidated his power, and it became a time of peace, and they called it Pax Romana, Roman peace. So during the period of the Gospels, that was just some background, life was pretty peaceful throughout the empire. Now, they had some border wars, but nothing big. And it's about this time that the first events of the Gospels occur, and that's the angel that shows up to Zechariah, and you get the pregnancy of Zechariah and Elizabeth, and the betrothal period of Joseph and Mary. So meanwhile, Herod, back to him again, around 40 B.C. to 4 B.C., so that's a long reign. He was a client king of Rome. He ruled over the kingdom as long as the Romans said you could, right? He wasn't in charge. And he was there when Augustus was at the height of his power, and Tiberius was beginning to come along to succeed Augustus. So that's the background. So during the reign of Herod, what was going on there and his sons, Judea was a kingdom that was subject to Rome. Okay, and they had to bow to whatever Rome wanted. The village of Nazareth, let's get to the Annunciation at Nazareth. So the village of Nazareth was really small. It was so insignificant. They weren't even able to find at this point, no recovered written records that mention Nazareth before you had the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But the home of Jesus from childhood until his public ministry, and it's the village where Mary and Joseph lived before Jesus. It's the essential site in the investigation of Jesus. So people have gotten curious about Nazareth. Now, it's located on a ridge, something like 1,100 feet above sea level, and sometimes that word has been connected to a Hebrew word for watch or guard, but it may actually be derived from another Hebrew word, Kennedy says. It says it's often connected to the idea of branch, and that ties into the book of Isaiah, talking about a branch from the root of Jesse. He was the father of David. And there's an inscription talking about Nazareth and that word branch from the 3rd or 4th century A.D., found at a synagogue nearby. And so branch may be closer to it, which is interesting. So Jesus comes out of the place where it says the branch will come, like the Messiah. Well, a few scholars said, look, we're not finding anything about Nazareth. It probably didn't exist. It was just made up at the time of Jesus. But for a long time, there really wasn't any archaeological evidence that had ever been recovered that demonstrated there was a village there during the time of Jesus. But as they've done more and more work, they are finding now materials and structures that actually do date to the 1st century in Nazareth. So that's interesting. There was a village. It was there. It was about 10 acres, so that's not huge. And it did exist in the 1st century BC through the 1st century during the time of Jesus. Maybe 400 people, they estimate. So they said that's why the village was probably not going to show up on historical texts. And that's why, if you look at John 1:46, somebody's saying, can anything good come out of Nazareth? That was probably basically saying, what? That little place, that podunk little town? So Nazareth was that location of one of the first events about the life of Jesus, the Annunciation of his birth. Now, it was set near the end of the 1st century BC, so we don't know exactly. But they found the village of Nazareth, they found parts of it under a church there and scattered areas, so it really was occupied during the time of Jesus. And then they talk about, okay, Mary and Joseph being betrothed. Well, what's the background as far as marriage at that time? Well, they said the bride and the groom would probably be in their late teens for the women and early 20s, maybe even early 30s for men. The man was always older, just about always older by several years, and said it's probable that Mary was in her late teens and waiting for the marriage. Well, then we get this idea of a census. About 8 BC, Augustus issued a decree for a census. And eventually it reached, of course, Herod and his kingdom, and they were part of the administrative province there of Syria. So in Luke 2:1, we hear about this census. It says, use the word that meant the inhabited earth. Well, that was the Roman Empire. It says that census seems to have been recorded in official Roman records, something called the Deeds of the Divine Augustus. And it mentions censuses of something like 4 to 5 million citizens. So that's empire-wide. That's really big. And it recorded how many males there were, something like 4 million. And it said it took place just before the death of Herod the Great in 4 BC. And that must be the one that Augustus issued in 8 BC. So that's massive. So if this census was imposed on Judea, and it would have been because that was part of the empire, Joseph could have been required to participate. And he would travel back to Bethlehem because that's apparently where his family home was, not Nazareth. And so Mary might have lived in Nazareth at one time, so they returned there. So then we get a transition of control. Herod the Great, and he presides over the entire region. Eventually, he's gone, and his sons take over, Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip. Right? So records from the Roman Empire this time demonstrate people did have to go back to their home for the purpose of the census. So the census seems to be something that was recorded in the Gospels. It was really going on in the world at the time. So it's not a made-up thing. Says the census order may have been relayed by a man named Saturninus, a legate of Syria, and Quirinius was a military leader. And then Luke mentions Quirinius, mentioning him as if he was administering the census instead of the legate, right? So in other words, there's a little bit of confusion about what does it mean about Quirinius and all, and so that's still kind of up in the air, but apparently he was connected with doing that work of census and so on. All right, so what about Bethlehem, right? So this is where they traveled. The town of Bethlehem, it's just about 5 miles south of ancient Jerusalem. It's been there for thousands of years. Until the time of Jesus, though, it's pretty obscure. It meant house of bread, also called Ephrath. It says it was occupied way back to the time of Jacob, so a lot of history to it. Now, it said, according to the early church writers, now if you want to go back and see what they said, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Jesus was born in a cave, they said, and apparently it was known in antiquity. And Origen, one of the early church fathers, reported the pagans spread the word about Jesus being born in a specific cave of Bethlehem. So maybe an animal shelter connected to a house. And they have something there for the birth of Jesus, a Church of the Nativity, it's called. Says the gospel accounts, talks about them going to Bethlehem and so on, and says they registered. And when they arrived, there's no place for them in what they call the guest room of the house. Maybe there were other relatives there. So sometimes that's translated in. But Luke clearly in other places uses the phrase guest room or an extra room in a house. And it says it's pretty unlikely Bethlehem would have had an inn. It's just a little village. So what did they do instead? They went to where the animals were kept. So probably a cave under or adjacent to the house. And that's according to early sources. He was placed in a manger. That would have been stone. In fact, they've got a picture here of an ancient stone manger found at Nazareth. So that was typical. Stone is all over the place. Wood was kind of scarce, so it probably wouldn't have been a wooden manger. And he says caves, by the way, were often used as storage areas for homes in the 1st century. You could keep animals there. And it said records that state Jesus was born in a cave go back to the 2nd and 3rd century. And excavations in the caves under the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem found evidence that they were used during this time period. So people in Bethlehem did indeed use caves. All right, so let's keep going here. The memory of the birthplace of Jesus, people had that in mind, and it may have preserved the location, and they had a church. And they found remnants of the original church that go way back, really close to the time of Jesus. So it's pretty interesting. So I'm going to skip over here. How about this? What about the idea of a virgin birth? Well, it said pagans, even in the 2nd century, pagans talked about that. And there's a man named Celsus. He claimed this idea of a virgin birth. That was just a fabricated story. And he offered his own version. Jesus was born of a poor woman, invented his birth from a virgin because his mother was sent away by her husband after she was convicted of adultery, and the biological father was actually a Roman soldier named Pantera. Right, so that's the story. And so it says, interesting, Celsus doesn't refute the story of the virgin birth. In fact, he says that story was pretty well known throughout the Roman world by the 2nd century A.D. So it said there's something going on, that these unique circumstances surrounding the birth of Jesus were known widely. It said, note that the pagan and Jewish sources don't dispute the birth of Jesus in the village of Judea under a scandalous situation. Yeah, so that's interesting too. What about the date of the birth? Well, it said there's criticism. People say, really, December 25th? That was a pagan festival day. That was just chosen by the Christians later on. And the weather doesn't work out. You can't have shepherds out in the field in December. It's too cold, and Jesus would have been born during a warmer month. But Kennedy says, not really. He said, according to weather data, Bethlehem in December isn't really cold enough to prohibit you from being a shepherd or staying out there. The average high in December in Bethlehem is 57 degrees. Well, shoot, that's not too bad. And the low is about 45 degrees. All right, that doesn't seem too bad. Maybe one snow day in the month. That said, ancient people who were shepherds routinely carried out their duties in colder regions than that. And it said staying with the flock at night was a common practice of shepherds, and it survives in some areas today. All right, so it said, according to information in the gospel narratives, if you sync them with the dates of festivals from the law of Moses, you can make an argument for the birth of Jesus in late December. Why? Well, in the Gospel of Luke, Zacharias was carrying out his priestly duties. That was probably the Day of Atonement, and that takes place September, October, when he was told that his wife, Elizabeth, was going to have a child. And just after the period of his service, Elizabeth became pregnant. That was probably the second half of September. 6 months later, in March, maybe late March of the following year, Mary became pregnant. You'll see that in Luke 1. After a 9-month pregnancy, that puts Jesus being born around late December. I think that's interesting. Let me skip further ahead here. Let's go to the Magi. I think that's interesting. So they've been doing some archaeological work near the Temple Mount, and they found a stone vessel fragment with the Aramaic inscription sacrificial offering, and it illustrated the practice of offering 2 doves or pigeons during the time of Jesus. And so that's probably what was going on there, that in Nazareth, where they go back, the Magi, it seems to be in Nazareth, the Magi encountered Jesus when he was a child, about 2 years old, maybe a little younger. Bethlehem is a less probable location, they said, because of chronological and narrative issues. So Kennedy is thinking it was Nazareth where the Magi went. So here are these misunderstood Magi. He said they're often called the 3 kings, but we don't know how many there were. We don't know who they were or where they came from. The idea there were 3, of course, is because they gave 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Gold was still used to trade and make purchases, but we don't know where that came from. Myrrh, that was used in anointing and embalming. And frankincense, that was a resin used in perfume, medicine, and embalming, were popular, and they were traded along trade routes. So they let me skip ahead here a little bit more. They moved to the, of course, we don't know exactly about the Magi. They could have come maybe from the Babylonian area. So let's move to the Star of the East, because I like astronomy. Okay, so the Star in the East. It's only in the Matthew account. So what's going on? Well, we got the word star is aster in Greek, but that could mean a lot of things: planet, comet, angel, or light, including a divine light. So it said the Hebrew word kokav, which is rendered as star, is often used to refer to angels and equated with the sons of God or angelic beings. Divine lights were often used to guide the Israelites, and one appeared before Paul on the road to Damascus. That's Acts 9. So it's possible the star could mean an angel or a divinely sent light, and not just a star, comet, or planet. Now, if it's a if it's a planet or a comet, there are only certain dates that work. There was a conjunction with Jupiter and Saturn from 7 BC. Some people have proposed that, but a conjunction is regular. People knew about that. Nobody would have been startled. And then what about comets? But the closest known comet that would have shown up was 11 BC. That was way before the birth of Jesus. And besides, they're often shown as bad omens, and they don't linger and reappear. So said it looks like it would not be a planet, a comet, or even a star. And it moved and went directly over the house where Jesus and his family were residing. So that star, and it makes it almost sound like it's alive, and Kennedy suspects it's some kind of angelic being of some kind. And it says the star just sort of appears, then it disappears, and then it appears again once the Magi leave and go take a look. The way the star and the action that it takes, he says, make a star, a comet, or planet interpretation impossible. They stars and comets don't give you a specific house in Nazareth. They don't appear. They don't disappear. The star was leading them. So it sounds like it was a sentient agent. So maybe an angel or divinely controlled light. So I find that really interesting. All right, so I'm going to skip over about the Magi here a little bit more because we're almost at the end of the chapter. These were obviously educated, intelligent men. They were experts in astrology, interpreting dreams, and they were often advisors to rulers. So they show up and find Jesus. And it said maybe Persia is where they came from. So it said it's no surprise that they would come from Mesopotamia because they had practiced these activities a long, long time. So he said, in addition to Matthew and Luke, you have secondary sources that record the birth of Jesus and corroborate some of the details. And it said these accounts seem to be pretty accurate as far as geographical locations, the names and positions of officials, what the political situation was like, what the Roman Empire, how it functioned, some of the cultural norms in Galilee and Judea. And it said even the specific events around the birth of Jesus were widespread in antiquity. So, and by the way, at the end of the chapter, he has let's see, here it is, a bibliography. Wow, I don't even know how many books, probably 30 or 40 books and articles that you can look at if you're curious about this time period. So that's a lot of material. That's chapter 1, Excavating the Evidence for Jesus. Excellent book. You can tell it's not difficult to read, and the pictures make it really come alive. So I recommend that book highly. Well, thank you for being part of this podcast. Take care.